Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today as we discuss, ahead of the climate change talks in Glasgow, which will start this weekend, the topic of climate change and the European Union from evidence to action, with panelists from Europe, but also with input from students, not just in Europe, but also from around the world. This panel and this discussion is hosted by Sciences Po Paris, but is part of a series of public conferences organized by CIVICA, the alliance of 8 higher education European institutions in social sciences. Climate change is now an inevitable reality, and it is changing our lives and our environment in an unprecedented way. And yet, there is still a reluctance to act. And unfortunately, the world is not on track to revert a climate breakdown. While commitments, and important commitments, were made in the Paris Agreement a few years ago to limit a temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, a recent UN report shows that we are heading towards a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase in temperature if present trends continue. In Europe, a leader in international climate change diplomacy, the European Green Deal is an ambitious roadmap for action. The European Union has set the objective of reaching carbon neutrality in 2050 by reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to the 1990 levels. But are the efforts made by Europe today sufficient? And will it reach this target? Or is the European Union plans to tackle climate change a utopian fantasy, to use the extreme words of the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban? Has the COVID-19 pandemic sidelined the climate change agenda today? And can we achieve climate justice and equity in our fight against climate change? What role can the EU play at the international level? And is it including really climate concerns in its foreign policy? And last but not least, what role for the youth? This is a conference that wants to empower the voices of the young in Europe, and this is why we're including today questions from students, including high school students. So some of these questions will be tackled today, and definitely more of these with our panelists, in interaction with you, our audience. So you will be able to ask questions directly on the chat forum on Zoom, and we will relay them to the experts to our panel today. And as I mentioned, we already also have important questions from high school students in France, which we will also try to include in this discussion. But first, we will hear from Myriam Dubois-Moncachi, Acting Vice President for Academic Affairs at Sciences Po. Bonsoir Myriam.
Bonsoir Dalal et merci. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Nous sommes ravis de vous accueillir aujourd'hui à la veille de la COP26, étudiantes et étudiants, chercheurs et chercheuses, mais aussi, au-delà de l'université, toutes celles ou tous ceux qui veulent mieux comprendre les enjeux de ces négociations, dans un contexte où les impacts du dérèglement climatique sont de plus en plus visibles dans notre quotidien. L'un des rôles de l'université est de créer un espace de rencontre entre le savoir et de les rendre accessibles au plus grand nombre. Au sein de l'université européenne CIVICA, l'objectif du cycle conférence Tour d'Europe est précisément de proposer au public des échanges avec des universitaires sur des sujets qui nous concernent toutes et tous. Ainsi, en 2021, nos collègues de l'Université centrale européenne, de l'Université de Bocconi, de l'Institut universitaire européen ont-ils accueilli des conversations extrêmement stimulantes autour de riches contributions de chercheurs et d'étudiants de toute l'Europe et du monde, autour de la démocratie en pandémie, la jeunesse européenne ou l'utilisation des données pendant la crise sanitaire. Nous ouvrons aujourd'hui une nouvelle phase de ce cycle de conférences en abordant la thématique des transformations environnementales. Pour Sciences Po, et de manière non exhaustive, cet intérêt se traduit dans sa formation initiale et exécutive par de multiples objets pédagogiques et de nombreux enseignements, irrigués par une recherche dynamique, elle-même soutenue par les centres de recherche de Sciences Po et l'expertise de l'atelier de recherche sur l'environnement. Une chaire européenne sur le développement durable et la transition climatique est également présente au sein de 2 écoles. Une récente mission d'approfondissement sur l'offre d'enseignement et de recherche sur cette thématique nous recommande vivement de la définir comme stratégique et prioritaire pour les années à venir. L'insertion professionnelle de nos étudiants n'est pas oubliée, avec la tenue annuelle du Forum sur les métiers de la transition écologique. Enfin, de nombreuses associations ou initiatives étudiantes mènent des actions en faveur de la protection de l'environnement. Avant d'ouvrir les échanges de ce soir, j'aimerais d'une part adresser mes sincères remerciements aux 4 universitaires experts de cette thématique de l'Université européenne CIVICA, ainsi qu'aux étudiantes et étudiants qui sont les acteurs de cette conférence que vous allez suivre. J'aimerais d'autre part adresser un salut particulier aux élèves des lycées Rotrou de Dreux, Georges Brassens à Neuchâtel-en-Bray, Benjamin Franklin à Orléans et d'Artagnan à Nogaro, qui ont été associés à cet événement et qui travaillent sur cette thématique dans le cadre des ateliers Premier Campus de Sciences Po. Mes remerciements vont également à toutes les équipes de Sciences Po et de CIVICA qui ont contribué à la préparation de cet événement européen. Il me reste à vous souhaiter une bonne conférence, où que vous soyez, en France, en Europe ou dans le monde.
Merci Myriam. And now, before we head to our discussion, I'm going to briefly present our panelists. They come from various European institutions that are part of the CIVICA network. First is Carola Klock. Hello, Carola. Carola is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Sciences Po's Center for International Research, CERI. Her work examines the politics of climate change negotiations, so she'll have a valuable input when it comes to the COP26 upcoming talks. She's also working on climate adaptation with a particular focus on small island states, and she's a focal point actually of the CIVICA network. Also with us is Sébastien Lévy. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Sustainability Center of the Hertie School, conducting research on climate politics and public attitudes. In his research, he examines public attitudes on different dynamics and climate policy instruments, the capacities of political institutions to organize emission neutrality, and the degree to which political environments shape public opinion across different countries. Also with us is Laszlo Pinter. Laszlo is professor and head of the department at the Department of Environmental Sciences and Policy at the Central European University in Austria. He is also senior fellow and former director of the Measurement and Assessment Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Canada. He's been working on sustainable development, indicators and strategies, integrated assessments, sustainability reporting, and global outlooks for nearly 3 decades. And also with us from the LSE, Suenia Surminski. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Suenia is Deputy Director and Head of Adaptation Research at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, part of the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science, overseeing social science research projects on climate adaptation, disaster risk finance, with a focus on insurance, loss and damage of climate change. She's a contributing author to various climate change publications, and before joining LSE, she worked for more than 10 years in the insurance industry working on climate and risks management. I would also like to introduce Alejandra Gurayeb, who's a research assistant at the European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition at Sciences Po, and she will be helping me gather the questions from the public. I'm going to start the first question with Carola. Carola, COP26 is now what everyone is talking about. And we're really here anticipating this event. What is at stake today at COP26? And can we say this is somehow the last best chance for countries to act to avert this climate breakdown and maybe, a disastrous future ahead of us?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I think that COP26 is a key moment. It's an interesting COP for several reasons. It's the first COP since the 2019 COP in 2019. So it's actually the first time that there was no COP in 2020. and that there was this long break in negotiations, so everybody's very keen to restart negotiations, and it's meeting in person, which has also drawn some criticism, but I think to make it worth their while to come to the UK despite all the travel restrictions that are still in place, the UK presidency really needs to show that something is coming out of this. I mean, time is running out. We've been negotiating for 30 years, and emissions are growing. So there is certainly pressure. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the last moment, but it's certainly, we don't have that much time to change the trend and reduce emissions.
And there's a question that keeps coming up among students as well. They're asking if these conferences, these COP conferences organized by the UN, are really useful. Has much been achieved thanks to these conferences, or is it something else aside from these negotiations?
I mean, I agree with this criticism that this is all talk. It's actually creating a lot of emissions by bringing in thousands of people from across the world. But we should remember that this is the only point, the only time that really all the countries from around the world meet and sit around the same table. And this includes both the large emitters, the polluters, but also those who suffer the most, such as the least developed countries or the small island states. And for them, it's very important to also be included in the talk. So if we were to move to other forums, we would leave out very important parts of the international community. And then I think it's also symbolically very important to have these meetings, to have these summits where thousands of people gather, because it shows to the world that that there is this problem, that this problem remains, that we need to get serious about it. But in the end, of course, implementation, actual action has to happen on the ground.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything about COP26 without going into details, because we could later on. Feel free. No? Okay. What we're going to do now, because really one of the main objectives of today's discussion is to empower the voices of the youth, the students in Europe and across the world. We've produced a few videos actually, that we're going to look at. The first one, which we're going to watch now, is each student is talking about the impact of climate change in their respective country, and then I'll leave the floor to the panelists to comment on that.
When it comes to the environment, I can definitely say that Romania has a very diverse landscape and rich ecosystems. A healthy natural environment is the backbone of the economy, and it is also important for the health and well-being of the Romanian citizens, of course. However, it needs effective protection. In recent years, there has been some progress, but many challenges remain in the country, from illegal logging to air pollution, from waste management to water quality. In order to tackle air pollution, it will be a key to progress on air quality monitoring, as well as tackling sources of air pollution, including the use of solid fuel by households, and ensuring better and more sustainable transport and energy sources. While Romanian legislation accurately reflects the EU environmental requirements, their implementation on the ground is a challenge in several of these areas, prompted mostly by a lack of planning, coordination and appropriate funding.
Climate change is already a reality in most of the Italian peninsula. Experts call Italy a hotspot for climate change due to its central position in the Mediterranean Sea. Both the influences of North African arid weather and Central European humid weather will have an impact in driving up temperatures about 20% more than the average global increase, and this will also cause a decrease in precipitation. However, during winter in Italy, we are witnessing an increase in the concentration and intensity of rainfall, which often leads to floods and landslides, while during summer we are witnessing an extremely hot weather with extensive wildfires and heat waves. Moreover, and more in general, Italy suffers from the persistence of an unequal infrastructure network and from the presence of organized crime and corruption in key sectors for the energy and ecological transition, which can put many roadblocks to it.
Estonia, that also is having very hot summers in the past few years, that then affect a lot also the flora and the fauna of the country. For example, fishes are highly affected by high temperatures, and there have been some mass, let's say, deaths of fishes that in warmer, let's say, conditions, especially in the lakes, tend to then not survive and die.
Indian economy is largely based on agriculture field. So the changes in atmosphere and ocean directly affect on the agriculture.
In Canada, we really felt maybe for the first time, it seems that the national consciousness has woken to the effects of climate change this year, with the massive heat dome that passed through coastal and interior British Columbia, moving towards Alberta, and the northern Pacific states in the United States, being Washington and Oregon. We saw the town of Lytton, BC, burnt to the ground in minutes, with the residents forced to flee. And it's not the first summer we've dealt with massive forest fires, but it's really the first summer that I think that we've linked these to climate change.
As we heard, these students really are, bearing witness to the reality of climate change. I mean, I don't know if we should still look for evidence per se. My next question is to Svenja. You mentioned in your work, you're working on what is called loss and damage. This is part of the impact of climate change on our environment, and which these students kind of touch upon. Can you talk to us more about what is loss and damage in this case, and why is it important to include this in climate negotiations?
Well, thank you very much, and hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I think what we need to realize is that we often talk about the risk of climate change. And yes, it is useful to talk about the future risk and what's happening, what the probabilities and so on. But at the same time, that also disguises the fact that it is a reality. And that's the starting point for loss and damage. Because with loss and damage, which has now become almost like the third part of what we're discussing under the UN climate sort of negotiations, where we're looking at mitigation, how you reduce emissions, where we're looking at adaptation, how you can be better prepared and reduce the impact. And then there's loss and damage. And that's becoming now a really key question, because loss and damage is already occurring. There are certain things that we can no longer avoid. Climate change is already in the system, and we are reaching certain limits of adaptation, and in particular, very vulnerable countries. I mean, I think there was a reference to low-lying island states. For them, these are existential questions. So the key question for the international community and for the negotiation is how we deal with that. And it's a very tricky issue, because it touches also on questions around fairness and equity and then burden sharing. Because by and large, those who are already experiencing loss and damage haven't really caused the problem. And how we then set up mechanisms that actually support people, countries, cities, but at the same time also ensure that they can switch, they can transition to a different type of lifestyle regardless of the risk. And that's kind of the key issue that we're looking at under loss and damage.
So are we looking into reparations, support for adaptation? Because if a lot of this loss and damage is in countries that have not caused, they're not the industrialized countries who've contributed tremendously to these emissions. The problem is, and I was going to touch upon this later on, is really the fact that developed countries during the Paris Agreement made commitments to pay yearly $100 billion for developing countries to adapt, to support them in their transition. And basically, no one has made these pledges. We're still lacking that funding. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, and this is going to be one of the key topics, I think, in Glasgow. You know, the message is very clear. I mean, really all efforts on reducing emissions, you know, that is paramount, because that we still have it in our hands to avert the worst of climate change. And, you know, no doubt that's going to be important in Glasgow. But then also, you know, providing enough funds, and there have been a lot of declarations, there is money committed, there's already money starting to flow. But what really needs to happen is to ensure that reaches also the most vulnerable, and those commitments are actually upheld. And also that we find ways to make sure that particularly those most vulnerable countries, you know, receive the support now and not just in the future. And that's, yeah, you can imagine, you know, that's not a straightforward task.
Yeah. I think climate justice and equity is an important topic. I'll go back to it because I think there's also an issue of justice and equity within Europe, not just between the developed and the developing world. Laszlo, I want to go to you. You've worked on the FP7 Impressions project, because we're still talking here about impact. And it's looked at the impact and responses related to extreme climate scenarios. Can you talk to us a bit about this tool and its importance?
I think what is important is that in our conversations about risk, vulnerability, and adaptation, we are honest about the scale of risk. You know, for a long time, going back many years, it has been difficult to talk about, 10, 15 years ago, about the real risks and costs associated with climate change. It was seen as somewhat inconvenient, and what we did in that particular project is we took climate scenarios that we thought were at the far end. Technically, these are RCP 8.6.5, 8.5, so more sort of scarier type climate futures, and looked at what their implications are based on science, and engaged people in various places around Europe. How would they be affected by the impacts of such extreme scenarios? And I think we need honesty, both in terms of scientific honesty about the real risks associated with those some higher end climate scenarios, which might actually be coming in some cases more likely, especially if we are not living up to the mitigation commitments, and also I think engagement on those. On that front can also be empowering, because when people are confronted by risks which are very different from country to country, as it was already illustrated by the student statements, they will also start thinking about adaptation options that would be highly contextual in their own regions and communities.
Thank you. Because you're talking about extreme scenarios and we're still talking about impact, I'm going to pick a question from the public, and I'm going to ask Sebastian, because you work on public attitudes. Someone is asking, Paul François is actually asking, COVID made very evident the large mistrust of the general population regarding science and medicine. How can scientists change this mistrust and convince people of the crucial need for climate action? Obviously referring to the climate skeptics who are still out there, despite the fact that climate change is very much a reality today.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's an important question, and that's not a question that can easily be answered. Because climate change skepticism has different forms and occurs in many different ways in different countries. So you have very strong climate deniers in regions like the United States, for example, which can really hardly be reached by scientists. And then you have other communities that are not necessarily sure that climate change doesn't exist, but they are also not so sure if it's going to be that harmful as many scientists argue it's going to be. And approaching these people is also difficult, but somewhat easier, because their unwillingness to engage with climate change has no foundation and a strong resistance to reality, but sometimes just rests in their situations of not being able to get this information, or a general distrust towards politicians or the communicators of climate change. One way to reach those people is, for example, through targeted communications. And it's not necessarily something that scientists can do, because things that scientists are good in is science, mostly. And sometimes also communication, but communication not always that much. But sometimes politicians may take up this task, or NGOs may take up this task, and they should design messages that really relate to the people. So there's, for example, certain studies where messages are directly targeted towards, for example, conservative audiences, and then delivered by persons who are trusted by these audiences, such as Christian priests that are really engaged in climate change, and military officials that talk about the risk of climate change.
And if I may add, as a journalist, I think the media has a role to play, and what's missing in the climate change narrative, in my opinion, is it's still depicted in a very technical way, or as if it's a high-level political issue or a very technical issue. We need to put a human face to the impact of climate change and tell people's stories. These are the stories that resonate the most and might change people's mind, because it's something they might see or experience close to them, close to their home. We're going to move now to the second video, and I think it's really the focus of today's talk. This is a video where the students are talking about the role of the European Union and the international community in fighting climate change.
Internationally, we should have a system to monitor the international determined contribution of greenhouse gases, and we should promote the researches on the field of climate change and its social impact. We could find new strategies only we have some new research. So we should promote the new research in this area, and we should find some solutions.
I believe, as a European citizen, that the European Union should be a leader in addressing climate change and forcing its decisions on member states, but also addressing the problem in a global way. In fact, we know that as of now, it's mostly developing countries that are contributing to global emissions, with the argument that the West did it for centuries to develop and reach its current wealth. To cope with this, we need to make renewable sources more efficient, so that business have a practical incentive to use them.
And in this context, we can say that the effort that the European Union is doing in achieving its net zero by in the next decades is a very important goal of climate mitigation. But in that level, also climate adaptation should be taken more into consideration, and giving the funds to, let's say, the specific countries or specific businesses to be able to cope with this. And for this reason, also in the next COP26, let's say, negotiations, it would be very nice to hear more about climate adaptation, and how especially the poorest in our societies will be helped to cope with, let's say, climate change, because they are the lowest social classes are the ones also that suffer the most the consequences.
Europe really has a role to lead these negotiations. I think with the absence of the US in COP26, or in the last 4 years of COP and their exit from the Paris Agreement before their re-entry under the Biden administration, Europe has really been carrying the kind of the flag bearer of Western democracies and rich Western nations in these negotiations, and we need to show the rest of the world that together we're serious about fighting climate change, so that we'll support developing and underdeveloped nations in their fight against climate change, and in their adaptation, and in their development of their economy. Because if we don't do that, if we don't lead by example, then there is no reason for other countries to cut their own emissions, because we are the ones who have made the most impact on this planet. We are the ones who have done the most damage, and it's time to take responsibility for that and lead the fight to cut these emissions.
So Europe really played an instrumental role in this regard, and I believe that the EU will continue to play a critical role for the upcoming COP26. So once again, it is sought to lead by example by upgrading its climate objectives for the year 2030, and the EU has made important efforts to re-engage with the new Biden administration in order to re-establish a strong and positive momentum in preparation for the COP26 in Glasgow, which is going to be extremely important because this year in Glasgow, countries must update their so-called nationally determined contributions, which is what countries have to submit under the Paris Agreement in order to respect their national climate pledges.
I think there are many questions and themes brought up by the students in this video. I'm going to start by focusing on the role of Europe before going to the rest of the world, the international community, the developing world. Carol, I'll go back to you. How far is the EU from achieving its objective in the European Green Deal, that is the 55% reduction?
I don't have any precise numbers to give you. Maybe some of the others can help me here. I mean, the European Union always has seen itself as a leader, and it has been quite active in the climate negotiation. But we mustn't forget that it's a set of very diverse countries with different national interests. Some of the countries have been quite good at regulating climate change at home. Others have more trouble. And so it's always a bit difficult for the EU just to get their act together and really coordinate among themselves and then to present a common front to the rest of the world. So there's this extra level. Overall, I think still I mean, it maybe the pandemic helps in that respect, I'm not sure. We certainly need to do much, much more, not because only of our current emissions, but also because of our historical responsibility. And also, I think, because of the symbolic power that the European Union has, and if we show the rest of the world that you can have well-functioning democracies and economies and still reduce their emissions. If we can do that in Europe, the rest of the world can do that too.
Sebastian, I saw you smiling when I asked the question. Maybe you can give us an indication of how close or far we are from the 55%, which is quite ambitious, because we keep hearing that Europe is a leader when it comes to climate change negotiations. But the question is it really, and has it progressed on its commitments?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I smiled because I think Europe is still very far from reaching its goal of 55%, by which I don't mean that it won't achieve that goal, but I mean that it's still at the very beginning of this really hard journey. You're right, Europe is a leader, or more precisely has been a leader so far. So Europe is the only world region where greenhouse gas emission has decreased substantially since the 1990s by around 20%, whereas in other world regions it has stayed marginally decreased or even increased. And Europe also has some of the strongest climate change policies in terms of carbon pricing and also in terms of renewable energy support. However, the goal of reducing emissions by 55% in 2030 compared to 1990 is really ambitious. Europe has just recently updated its goal from around 40% in 2030 to 55%. And it's really unclear whether this goal is going to be met. Europe met its goal before of the emissions goal in 2020, which was 20%. But not all members did. And Europe is now starting to journey to meet its goals, and it's preparing a substantial package with policies that is called the Fit for 55 package. And it is now prepared by a proposal on this package by the European Commission, and Europe is now entering a negotiation with all its member states on whether the ambitious proposals by the European Commission will find consent by the other member states.
Laszlo and anyone else feel free to intervene. Who is lagging behind? If we look at Europe, are there countries lagging behind, and why?
I mean, there's a significant political dynamic within Europe, both cross-nationally and transnationally. The important cross-national dynamic is mostly a conflict between more northern and Western European countries, like the Nordic countries, for example, but also France, or formerly also UK, compared to the more Central European and Eastern European countries. So in the Eastern European countries, climate change has not ranked among the top priorities of many of its citizens. They also have relatively little renewable energy potential compared to other countries. They often also rely much more on coal. And they're also not as rich as, for example, Nordic countries. And all these conditions make it really hard for these countries to adopt ambitious climate change policies and follow through with them. So this caused a lot of internal conflict in the European Union and creates a need for negotiation, finding a common solution that kind of fits all the different paces.
Yeah. Laszlo, do you want to add something about climate justice within Europe? Because I feel like there's a division between North and South, East and West, and we're not talking here about a unified Europe when it comes to adaptation.
If I may chip in on that. So Sebastian was speaking more from the mitigation perspective, I think. But from the adaptation perspective, there is also quite a significant discrepancy, and I don't necessarily mean in terms of impacts, because impacts are also quite significant. I mean, you consider, let's say, floods in Germany and so on, but in terms of adaptive capacity, which is the flip side of the adaptation equation, countries that that are still poorer and have weaker institutions, of course, will be more at the receiving end. And I wouldn't say by now that there is no awareness in Central East European countries of climate change. I think awareness is getting there. But if you look at some of the instruments of adaptation, such as national adaptation plans and implementation strategies, they still need to be stronger and better focused. I think there needs to be more sort of social engagement and ownership. So that and of course, if you go to many of these European large adaptation conferences, like I've been to ECCA in Glasgow last time 3 years ago, it's called European Climate Change Adaptation, but in reality, it doesn't really have the full spectrum of European participants, and Central East European countries were still largely missing. That was a fact.
Svenja, I have a question. One of these students mentioned, kind of enforcing compliance on countries that do not comply, and I have a lot of students asking about this. Is there a mechanism within the EU where we can enforce compliance, where there's, I don't know if there's a punishment mechanism?
Well, I think we're standing a little bit at a crossroad here, where for a long time a lot of what happened on the climate change front was voluntary, and it wasn't really enforceable, and you've seen a lot of commitments, and then it was even hard to monitor that. I think what I'm hearing now, and also going forward, there's talk about new monitoring systems being agreed in Glasgow, and more transparency that actually show whether these commitments are being made. And I think that's an important first step. I think when it then comes to accountability, I mean, this is difficult, and I think this is an issue that we see now actually taking place in the courts. I mean, there have been quite a few court cases where legal decisions were being made saying, look, I mean, you really need to do better. And there was a decision in Germany, for example, where the government was told by the court, this isn't ambitious enough, and you need to change your climate policy. And then at the same time, you see also, you know, public pressure and the role of, you know, of the young generation holding politicians to account. So I think there is a shift there. And maybe the last point I just want to bring in, I share all the views, and, you know, it is, I think we're really lagging behind action. But on the other hand, I'm also slightly optimistic that we are just seeing a shift, particularly when it comes to business, but also a lot of countries now really seem to be, you know, understanding that actually inaction will be more costly than action. And well, this morning we had John Kerry, Secretary John Kerry from the US Climate Change Envoy. He came to LSE and gave a talk, and he sounded actually very optimistic, because he said, look, a lot of countries, a lot of businesses now get that climate change, you know, is a necessity that we address it, but there's also an opportunity in doing it right and doing it quick. I mean, I hope he's right, but some of the examples he gave, and I think the recent commitments, give me a little bit of hope. But the accountability and holding those new commitments to basically saying, are you doing it? That's going to be important.
And when we talk about accountability, are we talking about the level, the national level, more like the businesses level, or it's like across sectors?
Well, I guess it's all of that. I mean, it also starts with us as individuals making choices, and, you know, election votes is one example. Us as consumers is another one. And, you know, you can go through business investment decisions, you know, trying to understand where actually your money goes to. And, you know, I see that now happening also in the financial sector, that at least there's more disclosure and more understanding. And the next step will be to then influence decisions based on that. But then I think also in terms of governments and politicians. And I think all that combined, you know, that could be quite a powerful mix. But we also obviously know that, there are quite a few obstacles in really following it through. But that gives me optimism, at least a little bit.
I don't know who wants to comment on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that in the European Green Deal, there are some business sectors that are not covered by the EU's carbon market, like agriculture, waste, building. Should these be included? Is that the way forward also, like to include more sectors? I don't know, maybe Carola, even Suenia, anyone, please pitch in.
If I may say something, I mean, actually this is planned. So, and this relates really well also to your last question, the question of sanctions and the questions of how much authority states have to punish climate's harmful behavior. And whereas we see in the international level a movement with the Paris Agreement to a bottom-up approach, where we have a kind of an unauthoritarian system where we invite each state to make pledges and to revise these pledges. We have a slightly different movement in the European Union. And here we have a movement towards more robust framework that actually imposes more and more sanctions. And currently we have the split in the EU. We have the carbon market, the EU ETS, which is really strict in the sense that if you don't comply with the emission cap, you have to pay money. And we have the ESD, the shared responsibilities, which is not as strict, but it's also becoming stricter. And what you're mentioning is there are certain sectors that are not covered by the emissions trading scheme, but by the other sectors. And there's now talk in the European Green Deal to include both the transport sector and the heating sector in the emissions trading scheme. And this is also a central proposal by the European Commission.
Yeah. I'm going to move a bit now from just focusing on Europe to the role of Europe in, you know, climate negotiations. I have a few questions from students here. What can the EU do to engage states that are particularly lagging behind, such as Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia? Maybe Carola, or Carola, do you want to say something about that?
I mean, Saudi Arabia in particular is just a very hard nut to crack. But I mean, generally, I think that there's always wiggle room at the negotiations to move countries towards some sort of compromise, and it's always a compromise. Nobody will ever be 100% happy with the outcome. The European Union, we shouldn't forget, it's a huge market. It has political influence, but it has also economic influence. And just by changing the rules domestically within the EU, they can actually have a large impact on other countries' preferences. Because in the end, it is all about money, and we shouldn't forget that. And then just also leading by example. I mean, this also, I think, has come up in the videos that the European Union has is a huge plays a symbolic role. It is a model. Other countries look to the European Union as a model to follow, as a sort of a good example. And we should just make use of that position that we have and really lead by example.
But it feels to me that the EU's foreign policy is not inclusive enough of climate concerns and the conflicts that are generated by climate. And I would give an example, trade relations that the EU has with certain countries. So yeah, it's leading maybe in negotiations, but my question here, and please, anyone feel free to jump in, is its foreign policy, inclusive enough of climate concerns today?
I think that's not, that doesn't apply only to Europe, but I think probably the broader category of the global north countries. We have to be more sensitive to the realities of poor countries that are very often at the front lines of climate impacts. And small island developing states are an example, but there are many others in actually almost Europe's immediate neighborhood who are really on the front line much more than Europe, not just in terms of impact, but also in terms of their extremely weak capacities, either due to war and conflict or just general institutional problems and legacies of their history. So I think investing not just a lot of money, but at an adequate level that is actually adequate and effective in addressing these problems in these weak neighbors and countries further afar. I think that would do quite a lot to build trust, and that hasn't. Europe has done quite a lot, and that, as it has been said, Europe has been a leader, EU, both the EU and individual countries. But it's also clear there is also there is a mitigation deficit. We are not going far enough, fast enough. Absolutely, the same can be said about adaptation, and I think we can really up the ante on that.
I have a follow-up question. You're talking about, not underestimating the context of developing countries. We're seeing climate migration, Laszlo, and there's a question from a student. What will be the scale of climate migration in the near and long-term future? We cannot underestimate that today a lot of conflicts and a lot of displacement is being caused by, weather or climate change conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, this is true. Climate is definitely an important and growing factor in eliciting migration. I think there is no doubt about that. There are also sort of more, somewhat, I would say, simplistic explanations that try to pinpoint just climate as the only factor. It's one of the factors. It's probably an increasing important one. But it's, the climate impact is wrapped up in much more complex sociocultural and political realities. And it, again, as we often say, it can become a threat multiplier. Now, who am I to predict exactly how serious it will be? It's already serious in many regions, and we don't just need to think about, international migration. There's also a lot of domestic displacement in many of these countries. So, yeah, we need better foresight capacity. I think actually we are working with UNDP on something like that to how can you build foresight capacity that can anticipate climate-related risk.
I'm going to take another question also now related to the rest of the world, to just walk away from Europe and its obligations. Maybe Carola, and please, any one of you, feel free to add whenever one panelist finishes. There are a few leaders that are not coming to COP26, and there's a student asking, what message are we getting from the presidents that are not attending COP26, such as, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Putin, Chinese leader, the Mexican leader? Is that significant, or that's not?
So I think there's two sides to this. Of course, it's symbolically, it's a problem because it sort of signals that we don't take it seriously enough, or that that there's other priorities. And I think that's not the message that we want to send. But we shouldn't forget that much of these negotiations are also technical negotiations, and that's actually not necessarily highest level that is sort of really coming to the conclusions at the event. So I'm not sure to what extent having more heads of state really necessarily brings about better results. But symbolically, it is very important. What we shouldn't, and finally, maybe it's just a smaller point on other leaders that would like to come but cannot come because of the travel restrictions. And I think that's also, for example, one of the reasons that the Chinese have that trouble sending people, and it's not the travel restrictions coming to the UK, it's more the travel restrictions coming back to the respective countries, because they have sometimes very severe quarantine rules of up to 3 weeks or so. And then that's just difficult to ask for people to take that time, and they can't necessarily take that time out of their job.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily, that they're not giving this a priority. I think the pandemic is playing a role, as you're saying. Sometimes it's more technical, and so like a high level leader might not be changing the outcome, but it could be symbolic also of the country's commitment to the issue. I'm going to take also another question. Maybe,
sorry,
yeah?
I think Svenja had.
Yes, Svenja, go ahead. I was going to ask you this next question. Please go ahead.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think it is quite easy to fall into that trap and say, look, what's the point? China is building new coal power stations, so what's the point? As long as they do it, we're all doomed. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. And of course, it matters what China is doing, but at the same time, I think the right approach is to lead by example and actually show that, this sort of decoupling of development and emissions is possible. And I think, that's the right approach. And, I would say there's a lot happening kind of behind the scenes and in playing with technology and so on. And it doesn't mean that we should put the finger off and shouldn't sort of hold those countries also accountable. But I think, it makes it even more important that we in the EU, in the sort of what we call sort of the global north, demonstrate that this works.
Yeah. I want to ask you, and then I want Laszlo to answer this same question as well, but you want to say something about this issue?
I just had one quick comment.
Sure.
To follow up on Carola's and Svenja's point, that I'm also not as much bothered by some heads of states not showing up for technical negotiations and so on. What does worry me, however, is that perhaps this is related to a more sort of general lack of trust, in the political system. Is this a sign of that? Because I think going forward, even now, to have successful negotiations and shared commitments, there has to be trust. within and among countries, and including among leaders. And I think that's in short supply, and I think we really do need a strategy to think about seriously. How to build a sort of trust that will make collaboration and joint action possible.
There's a question that keeps coming up, and we've heard it many times, and it's kind of dividing also leaders and nations. And a student is asking this again: who should pay for the climate transition? There's a feeling of injustice. I know we've touched a bit about climate equity, that the industrialized nations are the ones who kind of triggered the conditions we are in today, and they were able to do what they needed, what developing countries have to do today to develop. And it feels like developing countries feel a bit of injustice, to say the least. So who pays? How do we share the burden? Is there like a magic solution here? Laszlo, feel free, the others, Carola, Sebastian, Zwenia, to comment on this question. It's a big question.
Maybe I'll just add one thought. I spoke
Sure.
already too much and let others. But I think you can spin this question in a number of ways. And just one spin I would put on this is that if you look at some of the types of behaviors and our production consumption machinery, mostly in the global north, that has historically contributed to most to these problems. Many of them are not necessarily turning into well-being. I mean, these are also creating problems. So there is, the term is, uneconomic consumption and production. So cutting back on some of the high consumption, high sort of intensive production practices might actually have benefits for well-being. So it's a cost on the one hand, but it might actually turn into benefits in terms of well-being and quality of life. So I'm calling for a more sort of holistic accounting frame there.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I can chime in. I mean, that's a very good point that Laszlo made, that we shouldn't always think about this as this big burden and all this cost, but it's also actually opportunities and things, change for the better. I mean, renewable energy, of course, yes, there are upfront costs. You have to pay for the solar panel to put on your roof, or the wind turbine, but the wind and the sun is for free in the end, and we don't have to pay for that anymore. So it's high upfront costs, but then in the end, it's more beneficial. It can actually be cheaper than coal.
Yeah, I think the idea is that these countries can develop. They don't have to do it the same way the others did many, many years ago.
And to some extent, there is some commitment to provide for that upfront cost, or to provide funding for both mitigation and adaptation, where it's more difficult to make a case for profits and investments. So in the Paris Agreement, there is a commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year for the Global South, and currently the negotiations need to come up with a new objective by 2025 of support for the Global South. Also, again, I mean, it's a big question, and if you look at the actual numbers, it's not that easy to mobilize that funding, and then also ensuring that it reaches the right people and also does the right projects and the right measures, because not every measure really is helpful. I think others want to jump in as well.
Svenia, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think, globally there's one question, but also within countries, and we've seen that, we've seen people getting angry when the cost of energy rise. And, that is an important aspect to address. How can we make this fair and just, and how can we ensure that, this transition doesn't create new, inequalities? And I think it really is important to link it then to general questions. I mean, for example, if people are angry about rising prices of energy, well, at the same time, they're also angry that there is not taxation of certain company profits. And, there is a bigger picture. And I think what I really would worry about is if governments continue to look at these sort of very piecemeal. And I think we've seen that with the first wave of you know, sort of protests, climate change becomes a little bit the scapegoat for these measures. But, you know, there's much more at stake. And I think that's where governments, you know, also need our advice and support. How can you come up with a strategy that actually works and that addresses these inequalities? And I think that's going to be a key question going forward.
There are two important questions that I have here from students related to growth and development, and maybe Sebastian, you want to take that one. Is degrowth the solution? Because someone is saying, to what extent is our economic system based on infinite economic growth that is compatible with a reduction of emissions? So can we reach you know, carbon neutrality and the targets that we want as long as we're growing?
I can't really answer this question in detail, but I think it relates very, very well to the discussion that we had before, and especially the discussion on equality. Because the question is not whether everybody has to degrow or whether everybody is growing too much. The question is who's growing too much. And there's a lot of world regions who cannot degrow because they actually have to grow economically to satisfy very basic needs, which the other speakers have discussed in quite some detail in their last statements. And also the other issue is that the emissions, and Svenja was pointing to this, are really unequally distributed across income groups. So whereas the lower income groups have actually decreased their emissions slightly over the last decades, the highest percentile and the highest 10% of the income groups have actually increased their emissions massively. So I don't know if degrowth for everybody is the solution, but surely there's something wrong with the unequal distribution, accumulation of wealth, and of emissions as well.
Anyone else? Laszlo, do you want to say anything about this?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, that's next year we will have the 50th anniversary of publishing Limits to Growth, which was a very seminal book in the early 70s. And so it's a timely question. And complicated. You know, the question is, you know, growth of what? I mean, it really goes back to that question, because if it relates to meeting basic human needs, as Sebastian also mentioned, you know, there are a lot of countries, or even within rich countries, you have a lot of people who can't meet their really legitimate basic needs. So obviously there is room for growth at that level. But if you're talking about, you know, meeting wants that are kind of far out in terms of their contribution to well-being and you know, just problematic in terms of fair share and so on. That's a different story. Unfortunately, of course, you know, we have production consumption machineries, infrastructures, especially in rich countries, that cater to the satisfaction of wants, not just needs, and how you transform that along with an economic theory and practice that is fundamentally set up to maximize growth. That's a long journey, and we haven't really cracked that in an adequate way. And I think it is important. It is an important one.
Also, to stay in the growth discussion, someone is asking what can be done to further engage businesses in climate action. And we know that there are big companies who are major also polluters out there, and this has come up a lot in the questions. Svenja, do you want to say something about this? Engaging the private sector, the businesses?
Yeah, I mean, it is hugely important, and you know, without having solutions and change happening in the private sector, you know, we're not going to get anywhere. I think, you know, I like to say, look, this is a mix of sticks and carrots. So, you know, of course, you know, it would be great if we could just say, look, you know, we're setting the right incentives and then they all do the right things and it would be fine. We all know that that's not the case. So, you know, the sticks in form of regulation, in form of pressure. I mean, I mentioned the court cases and also consumer pressure. That is hugely important. And I think there is a shift there. I mean, I'm talking a lot to businesses, and I think when I ask them, you know, what has changed? Why is this suddenly an issue? And, you know, they give me different reasons. And I think, you know, one point that we shouldn't ignore, also given the audience here, a lot of board members or CEOs of companies say to me, look, I mean, when I come home and I sit at our dinner table and my kids ask me about what I do and what my company does, you know, I need a good response, and, you know, I can't no longer ignore this. And, you know, we shouldn't underestimate that. That has an impact personally. And okay, well, I think there is also, of course, a lot of greenwashing happening. And, you know, we all need to be very aware of that and avoid, you know, falling into that trap. And I think that's, again, where transparency and also standards are probably useful. So I think it's a mix of, yeah, sticks and carrots.
To go back a bit to the EU, someone is asking about the carbon border tax proposed by the EU. Carola, I'll ask you this question. What happens with the climate measures that can be seen as protectionist measures? So they're considering this carbon border tax as a protectionism.
We have had this in the past as well, where measures to protect the environment were then understood or interpreted by others as protection, and then we had lengthy discussions and negotiations, and not always in favor of the environment. I think, I mean, the market is distorted. It's not as we have a free market. We have so many fossil fuel subsidies, for example, right? So why is nobody asking whether that is protecting some sectors and some industries, and shouldn't we get rid of that? And I think that would actually get us a long way. So I think it's an easy excuse to say this is then protectionism, and we can't have it.
There's also, when it comes to specific policies and sectors, we're still within that. And as a follow-up to the private sector, someone is asking about the role of aviation. Has there been any progress in the sector's reduction of emissions? Who wants to volunteer on this one?
So I'm not an expert on aviation. Sebastian, you can help me then. There has been discussions on aviation, also maritime transport, so shipping. It's been very difficult to find agreements, also because it's very difficult to regulate in practice, because it's kind of by definition international. But this is being discussed, and we shouldn't forget. I mean, I think flights have. I mean, the transport sector is clearly a large polluter, but it's not the only one, and it's not necessarily even the largest one.
I mean, flights are interesting because they're definitely one of the harder nuts to crack. And they are also one of the sectors that most people can relate to. I mean, most people cannot relate to the CO2 emissions that are released in the process of creating cement, right? This is not something that we think of, but we all think about our vacation flight and whether this is compatible with a net zero world. And it's difficult, and obviously there hasn't been any progress in terms of reducing emissions. To the contrary, flights are increasing and are projected to increase a lot. But there has been slight increase in policies. So for example, Germany increased its tax on flights. The EU has slightly including flights in the EU emissions trading scheme. And the industry is doing a lot of research. So there's a lot of research, for example, on sustainable aviation fuel. So how can we create fuel that is actually carbon neutral, for example, using synthetic fuels or using biofuels. But these are very, very costly at the moment. And it's really hard to think of the pathway that we have to walk through of how we get these technologies cost competitive. And this, I think, relates really well to the question that one of the students asked before, on how can we get businesses on the boat? How we can make businesses invent better technologies and make these technologies better and cheaper. And I think to do that, it's really important to be predictive, to make policies that are predictive and to commit to policies. So to commit, for example, of taxing kerosene, taxing aviation fuels in the future. And this, in the end, can then provide security to young innovators to really invest in these technologies and make them more cheaper in the next decades.
Laszlo, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, just maybe a little in a broader sense, and it goes back to one of my earlier, more philosophical points that, if you look at this from the perspective of, why are we flying? This thought is not going to make me popular with airlines, I guess. But there's a whole class of people and industries that kind of are run on a model that your staff will hop on one flight to one end of the country this morning and to another end of the country the next morning. And I know because there was a time in my life, when I lived that, and there is no quality of life in that. Again, if you look at the sort of what's the payoff of maintaining a type of system, when that actually requires that level of intensity of travel. At some level, it's becoming uneconomic and certainly not conducive for human well-being. Let alone, I'm not even talking about then the climate impacts. So again, you can sort of look at this in different ways.
Thank you. I think we've covered a bit of Europe's role in the international community, the sectors, etc. I would like to go now to the third and last part of our video today, where the students are talking about the role of youth in fighting climate change.
According to the UN reports, there are 3.5 billion people under 30s living on this planet. That makes half of the world population. So the future of this world depends on the youth. I believe that youth has the potential to let go of the past differences and strive towards the pressing climate changes that needs to be dealt with.
I think that since young people are going to be most impacted by the impacts of climate change over the next few decades, they continue to have a major role to play, and they are already engaged in a number of NGOs or UN platforms which associate civil society to the ongoing process of climate negotiations. But I think that it is very important to improve these platforms, and youth should be associated more closely because, as Greta Thunberg has emphasized,
I think that thanks to the protests and climate strikes of 2019, youth is nowadays more engaged in climate negotiations than in the past. However, I often feel as youth presence is being tokenized instead of being taken seriously as a central part of the debate. I definitely wish it was more present, as new generations will inherit this world and its many challenges ahead.
Thanks to the 2019 protests, the youth started being more present. However, there's a big risk of shifting the attention from big corporations that are polluting the world to the individual sense of guilt, which is limited in its actions. This can be very dangerous, in my opinion. To conclude, as a social sciences student, I believe it is my duty and our duty to improve society and work for the better.
I mean, it's obvious that the impact of climate change is on the young and the future generation, but I have a feeling when we talk about the role of the youth in fighting climate change, there's one image that comes to my mind. It's protests. It's Greta Thunberg. I feel like they're still in the backseat, whether it comes to negotiations or action. They're not really part of the narrative yet. So my question, Svenja, maybe you can talk a bit about how to increase and to allow the youth to really be part of the discussion and to sit at the front and not in the back seat or outside where they're protesting while negotiations are ongoing.
Yeah, well, and really powerful comments there from the students on this. So, I mean, I'm also a mother, and I see this also through the lens, you know, of my children and their future. And I think, in a way, you know, I think this is a question of making voices heard, but at the same time also, you know, showing what's possible. I mean, what I noticed is there has been a shift, for example, in schools and curriculum. So, you know, climate change is there. So I think there are hardly any school children. I mean, I don't know how this compares across different countries, but, you know, at least here in the UK, it is a core topic. And, you know, you can't go through school without learning about climate change. And I think that's a huge thing. But then the question is what you do with that knowledge. And I find it amazing when then children, even at a young age, start initiatives, even at a local level, and implement change locally and get involved. And I think that speaks to so many, you know, sort of skills that you actually, you know, want to see in the next generation in our society, you know, taking responsibility and so on. So I think that's an important part. But at the same time, I think there's also a huge danger of sort of having a disconnect. I mean, you know, it's great that there is a growing awareness and also the protests and engagement. I think now in Glasgow we'll see a huge representation from young people. But, you know, is that really representative of the young generation? And I sometimes, you know, when I look, I think we also need to be careful, you know, how we take the big majority along, and for whom, you know, this doesn't really feature in their daily lives and in their daily struggles as well. And I think that's an important part to also mobilize and make sure that, you know, this is part of you know, civil society and playing your role in that, and giving people also a chance to play a role in society.
Since you mentioned civil society, there's a question about that. I don't know who wants to answer that, but what role can civil society play specifically when it comes to the youth, if we can give some concrete examples about the way forward? I mean, a lot of youth is engaged with environmental organizations, local and international. As I said, they're at the forefront of like the protests. But is that enough? What else can civil society do to advance the youth agenda?
Maybe I can.
Yeah, Carola, go ahead.
Go ahead, Carola, go ahead.
No, I mean, I would want to say that, I mean, and the pandemic has shown that again, that often politics don't take the youth seriously enough because they're not voters. So in the next elections, you know, you won't see necessarily much impact if you've done something for the youth. But the youth, of course, I mean, as soon as they're 18, they can vote. They should vote. I think that's very important, because we see also that absenteeism is relatively high among young people. And of course, they have parents and they have grandparents, and they can tell their grandparents and their parents, like, influence those voting behaviors. And and most people in our society are parents or grandparents, and so I think that's an important channel. The other thing is that actually the youth has been very active, very well coordinated, at least that part of the youth that is engaged. And I agree with Svenja that it's not necessarily everyone. But in the Fridays for Future strikes have shown that they can have tremendous impact. I think it's because of their strikes that so much has been done, and that there is all this awareness today that we're talking about climate change much more than we were 3 years ago. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact, the influence that the youth can have and that they have.
Sebastian, since you work also on public attitudes, do you agree that the youth has a role to play to influence public opinion? And there's a question that I will ask you from our students. What is the EU doing to engage the European youth in climate policy decisions, if it is? I mean, this is a question to be asked.
I mean, definitely youth has played a large role in the last years. I mean, we see this massive Fridays for Future protests that dramatically changed the political landscape across Europe and across many countries in the liberal democracies in the West in terms of climate change. And the youth is doing so for a reason, because they are going to be the ones who are most impacted by climate change. And I'm actually quite optimistic, at least what I see here in Germany, because we do not only see that civil society organizations have channeled youth behavior and youth activism, but also that we see a lot of young people who moved into the new German parliament in last year. So we had general parliamentary vote a couple of months ago, and every third member of parliament now is under the age of 40, which is quite young in German terms. And there's even a lot of people, around 6%, who are under 30 years, so 20-somethings who are now in the German parliament. And I think this can also be really important, I don't know, give important energy to the German politics, at least what I hope. This is kind of the optimistic story, and the pessimistic story is that I don't know of any initiative that the EU plays in order to help young voices.
I have a question. We see the rise of green parties in Europe, I mean, in Germany as well. Has the youth any role to play with that? Is their main voting base youth-driven, so it's the youth who are voting green, or it's not related to the age demographics?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the youth vote sort of green, and if only the people until 30 or 40 would be allowed to vote, then we would have a green chancellor in Germany today. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because the youth is generally voting more radical. So the youth is not voting the established parties anymore, those the social democrats or the conservatives, maybe because also they haven't done such a great job in managing the pandemic for the youth. But a lot of young people are voting for the Greens, but also for the market liberal FDP. And even in some regions in Germany, like Saxonia, they are also in the majority voting for the right-wing populists in those regions.
Anyone? Yeah, Laszlo, go ahead, please.
You're muted, I think.
You're on mute.
Laszlo?
You're on mute.
We will wait.
Got it. So again, to add a slightly different perspective, I think while it's certainly important for youth to be very proactive, but at the same time, we also have to realize that our institutions also have to be more receptive to actually, having the ability to channel and do something with the input that is coming from you. And that and one example, which is perhaps a bit of an odd example, but I think it's an important one, is in traditional cultures, the 7-generation rule. In some traditional cultures, North American, Aboriginal, and so on, the institutions actually had a place at the table for the representative for future generations. So it was institutionally embedded in the decision-making process, the perspective coming from not even just the next generation, but the next and the next and the next. So we have to enlarge, especially because of the complexity of the problem and the scale of the risk. I think we have to engage the time horizon, and our institutions have to have much better ability to do that. And incorporating youth and their considerations in those processes is one important way for doing that. So we also have to work to do on that, at that front.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, institutionalizing, their contribution, giving them an actual official seat in negotiations or, in the future within these institutions. This might come off as a weird question, but someone asked this. I don't know, Suenia, maybe you want to take this one. Climate change is causing anxiety among the youth. How can we manage it and live with it? It seems like the youth is more and more aware of climate change and is worried, maybe more than the older generation.
Yeah, this is actually a really good question, because I think it also alludes to a general observation that anxiety and depression and mental health issues are hugely on the rise. And, I think there are many factors, and, I'm not an expert, but I see it, and I also experience this in a way. So I think climate change can be one of the drivers. And I think, that feeling of, wow, we're all doomed and it does really look bad. And, what I'm sort of hopeless and can't change it. I think, you know, that can trigger and contribute to that. And I think when it comes to climate change, I guess the question then is also to make sure that we're using the right narratives and that we still, you know, also present, you know, this as part of a trend. I mean, I often refer people to watch the David Attenborough documentaries. I don't know how popular he is outside the UK, but you know, if you have a chance to see that, and you halfway through watching that, you get to a stage where it really looks bleak, and you're almost in tears and feel like, oh my God, what are we doing to our planet? And then somehow he often manages to turn it around and to say, look, but you know, it is feasible, and there are things, and it matters, and you know, we can do it. And you know, I think that's on all of us to sort of maintain, look, it is possible, it is a huge task, but you know, we need to act on it, but it's not sort of hopeless. I think that's an important part.
Yeah, probably focusing on the solution than the problem itself. Carola, you had something to add.
I just wanted to add something. I had somebody from the Seychelles talk to my students, and he was just arguing that giving up is not an option for them. And I think despair is not an option. I fully understand that, you know, that it is depressing and it is gloomy, but giving up is not an option. If the pandemic has taught us something, is that we can actually change very quickly and very rapidly. I mean, nobody would have thought that, you know, we could lock people up in Western democracies for weeks without end, and yet we did. So I think we shouldn't underestimate what is possible if only we want to.
Anyone else wants to? Laszlo, yeah. You're the good student. You always have your finger.
Maybe this will be my last contribution. But you know, this is real, but it's not new. And I can tell you very precisely the moment when climate change as a risk hit me personally. And I was probably around 14 years old. I was sitting on a Sunday at the dinner table with my family. We had the radio on, and some odd scientist was talking about climate change. That someone, you know, thinks this is going to be a problem. And I listened to that, and in like 3 seconds, it hit me that this is not a joke. I left the table. I got on my bike. My parents had no idea what was going on with me, and I had to go out for 2 hours on my own to try and kind of grapple with this. So here I am, you know, and it became energizing in a certain way. And I think we probably individually have, you know, we face challenges like this, and we have to come out strong at the other end. So
that's an inspiring testimony. I hope it inspires others. I think, Svenja, you touched upon the role of schools already, and you mentioned how in the UK climate change is part of the curriculum and you have to study about it. But there's still a question about this, and maybe someone else wants to answer. What else can the schools do to play a role in engaging the youth and raising awareness about climate change?
Maybe I can. Lucinda, go ahead.
Go ahead, Carola. I already said something on that. Your turn.
Well, again, I think we shouldn't. I mean, and of course, it's the big polluters that have to do the most, but that doesn't mean that we can't do something in our lives as well. And again, I think by sensitizing people, creating awareness, and also showing sort of small solutions, small steps that can be taken. I mean, don't drive to schools. Don't drive your children to school, for example. And I think children are great agents of change. Children are much more willing to experiment and to try out new things. And as I said, they have parents, they have grandparents, they do have reach, so they can, I think they can change lots, and schools can certainly help them organize and get together with others, with friends, and then really change things in their local communities. And there's, I mean, I've seen it in the chat as well, there's so many things that can be done on a local scale.
Yeah, and one thing I would like to add, I mean, it's certainly important to focus and to raise awareness among students, but I mean, it doesn't even matter more is also to focus engagement on our audience now. So as university students who are not like children, young people anymore, but may really shape the future within the next decades. And this is really what counts. So I really hope that the children who are now 8 years old don't have to worry in 20 years about climate change now, because we made a big step in the transformation. What hopefully really counts in the next 10 to 20 years. And here the youth, so the students who are now like, I don't know, 20 to 30 years old, I mean, they have a great position and a really responsibility and also an opportunity. So we have this great transformation of our whole society and our whole economy. And it's really up to those generations to invent things, to change businesses, to change politics. And it's a great opportunity to take part in this great transformation. And we should, I think, highlight these opportunities that young people can now take. And the other thing is that you I think, should do is also to watch the hands of the politicians with specific policies they make. And with that, I mean, obviously, if they make enough climate change politics, but also which kind of climate change politics they make, because it's going to be a big intergenerational distribution taking place. And we should be careful that policies are made that really do not harm and put the burden on future generations.
Thank you. That's a good way to end the section on the youth. I do still have some questions not related to the youth role specifically that we'll try to answer since we have some time left. There's someone mentioning the correlation between fighting climate change and human rights. Are they mutually exclusive? Is it possible to have it all? Maybe someone wants to talk about the impact that climate change has had on human rights? No? No one? Carola? Do you want to volunteer on this one?
I mean, actually, we can shift. Basically, I think shift the framing around, and if we focus on the right to a healthy life, a healthy planet, then actually fighting climate change is fighting for our basic human rights. And I think that's a great way to motivate and mobilize people, even people that may be, you know, less concerned otherwise. But I mean, it's a basic right to live in a place, you know, live in safety, and climate change is a security risk, right? So I think we can. It is very much related.
Well, and if I may.
Yeah.
We also. Yeah. We also talk about, let's say, access to clean water as a human right, access to food, and of course the impact of climate change. I mean, this is all, of course, wrapped up in the broader sustainability, unsustainability discourse. But climate change as a risk multiplier has an impact on all those basic rights. Water, food, clean air, and so on. So that's where this more sort of perhaps difficult and complex challenge becomes actually very tangible at the level of the communities, individuals, families, and so on.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to add on this, on human rights and climate change? Svenja, you have your hands.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Laszlo said, this is part of what we say, it's sustainable development. And if you need to achieve a lot of things there, and human rights are at the core of that as well. I just wanted to say, we've talked a lot about the youth, and I think in this context, it's also about, maintaining future human rights. And, if we not take action, basically we are infringing the human rights of that generation that, is already born or will be born soon. So I think that intergenerational aspect around human rights is important.
Yeah, I think that's very important, because I think our generation is somehow stealing the future of, the future generation and their right to live, in a good environment without, this climate breakdown. This is a more specific question. I don't know how we can interpret this. Someone is asking how to switch from business as usual investments to climate-friendly investments. So they probably mean, how can we invest and make money, but in a way that is protective of the environment? Maybe someone wants to give some examples or projects that are being done. I mean, I'm thinking of maybe renewable energy is one. Like, I think the whole concept of a circular economy is, falls within that.
I I mean, we're currently seeing...
But someone else can kick in.
Sebastian, yeah?
Svenja, do you want to say something? Or... I mean, we're seeing the investment in clean energy at the moment right now. So, I mean, renewable energy is really uptaking, and even other technologies that are a bit more expensive than renewable energies are taking up, like electric vehicles, or even fringe technologies like carbon air capture are taking up. And so direct machines that can directly capture CO2 from the atmosphere and store them. And there are multiple of different ways where we can incentivize these technologies. And one way is, for example, social norms. So the reasons why people buy these offsets from direct air capture machines is just because it's a good thing to do, and companies want to look green. So they spend more than 100 euro per ton of CO2 to buy carbon offsets and thereby financing this technology. And the other ways are obviously policies. So if we commit to phasing out fossil cars, then obviously the industry is going to think of cleaner technologies. And obviously they're going to think of investing in electric vehicles. And if you put a price on carbon and make coal and oil and natural gas combustion much more expensive, obviously investment is going to flow to renewable energies. And this is what we really have to incentivize. And we have to give security, investment security to innovators and young companies to really invest in any of these cleaner technologies in the future.
Yes, Laszlo, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a very significant lever. And I think this is an area where you actually see a lot of progress, certainly at the level of rhetoric, but probably also in terms of substance, you know, specific funds set up with sustainability or climate-friendly screens and whatnot. But I think the other side, the flip side of this is that I don't know what's the statistics, but I'm pretty sure that a vast majority of people have no idea what the funds that their pension funds, for instance, are in, you know, what it's invested in. They are simply just not informed. So I think there is also a responsibility on those who invest small or larger to actually get informed, because you might find out that you are actually, you know, you might have a nice green and sustainable mindset, but you are actually investing in coal mines or whatever else you don't want to.
Yeah, how you're managing your financial portfolio, buying stocks in companies, maybe picking those who are, you know, greener than others. So you're investing, but at the same time, it's kind of responsible investment. There's a question about the current status of global emissions. Did COVID reduce them? Are they still on the rise? Laszlo, maybe you want to continue on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been, I don't have sort of the up-to-date, but this has been documented along, you know, some other potentially positive impacts like local improvements in air quality in some of these Southeast Asian countries and so on, or probably even in Europe. So that's a direct link, but you know, I think the real question is, are those temporary gains only? You know, and some probably are. Now that we are rebounding, you know, everybody's happy. You know, we are back at the GDP, right? You know, GDP is back, and okay, hooray, we're done with the crisis, and we have programs like the Green Deal, but these really have to be tested on the substance of what impact they actually have, and you know, how can we make sure? And I don't think we can really make sure that this at the moment, not on this time scale, that these become sufficiently transformative. They are significant, but I think the transition we are talking about. I think it is very complex, and I'm not sure that COVID's impact is in any way sort of a solution.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's sustainable. As you said, we're kind of going back to business as usual, back to the old habits maybe, although, you know, there was a question there that, you know, maybe we learned a lesson, that the lifestyle is going to change, but that's not certain. There's a question actually about the Paris Agreement specifically. Sebastian, maybe you want to take this one. What happens if the 1.5 you know, limit, the 1.5 target is not reached? And it looks like it's not, as I mentioned in my introduction. The UN says, you know, we're heading to a disastrous 2.7 plus increase.
Yeah, it's a good question. The good thing is we're not falling off a cliff. So there's sometimes this picture that we really have to reach 1.5, and if we don't reach 1.5, we're going to end up in disaster and everything is going to bust. And I think this is I mean, I understand the necessity of highlighting the benefits of reaching 1.5, and they are massive. So there's recently been an IPCC report, I think 1 or 2 years ago, which kind of sketched out the differences of what would happen if we reach 1.5 or 2.5 and degrees Celsius increase of global warming. And with 2 degree warming, a lot of more small island states are going to hit hard. Carola, maybe you can talk about this. There's much more species going extinct, I think 14% compared to 6% with only 1.5 degrees, and extreme heat events are going to rise. But it's not that it's the end of the world. I mean, it's going to be extremely costly, especially for people that are not represented on our panel and probably not that much in our audience. But it's not the end of the world, and each 0.1 degree is worth fighting for, and there's no natural stop fighting for that. So even if we cross 1.5, there's this struggle of reducing climate change is going to continue. And there's also another dimension on this. There is a way of going back. So with the EU Green Deal, Europe has not only committed to become net zero by 2050, it is also committed to go into negative emissions post 2050. And I think this is an important narrative that we should focus on. So we're probably going to overreach. I mean, hopefully we reach 1.5, but it's highly unrealistic. But we will have to make sure that once we overshoot, we go back.
I just want to say that maybe it's not the end of the world, but it's the end of the world as we know it. And I think if you already think about the changes that we've seen with 1 degree warming, so think the wildfires, the heat waves, the flooding, it's not pretty. And it's not, the problem is it's not even, things don't get worse on a linear basis, but it's an exponential curve. And we've learned with the pandemic that exponential growth is really bad. So I think, indeed, every single degree point counts. And the sooner the better for everyone. But it's again, some of the countries that have contributed the least that suffer the most, which is this extreme injustice of climate change. Just as an anecdote, to also think that actually we already can do something to be sort of negative emissions. So Bhutan, for example, which is a least developed country, you know, basically no CO2 emissions, very limited CO2 emissions. But they have in their constitution, it's written that for every tree that you cut down, you have to plant, I think, 3 new trees. So they're actually the first carbon negative country of the world. So there are solutions, and we certainly need to use whatever we can to limit the warming as much as we can.
Is decarbonizing energy generation a solution? We're hearing, especially here in France lately, the French president has kind of changed his stance on nuclear energy. There's a whole discussion ongoing about starting small-scale nuclear power generation plants. Is nuclear the solution? Is it really helping fight climate change? Anyone wants to talk about this? Svenja, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on nuclear, but I have a position, and I think we all know that nuclear creates a lot of problems, and it also leaves future generations with a lot of problems. So I think, I mean, I understand that there is probably a role for nuclear to help with the transition, and I think also in terms of technology, I understand that there are, alternatives to the way we currently use nuclear, and, more efficient, presumably more safe. I don't know if if that also applies to the waste problem. I mean, for me, that is the big challenge. But I think also realistically, you know, we're going to realize that these net zero ambitions and these plans, you know, they are technically feasible, but they will require some difficult choices. And, you know, a lot of experts I talk to say that they think there is at least a transition role for nuclear in this.
Mm-hmm. So more as a transition as an end goal. I'm going to. Anyone wants? Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that, I mean, transition maybe in the sense of having, you know, the ones that we have, the nuclear power plants, but building new nuclear power plants, I don't think that's helping the transition in any ways. And I think, I mean, we need the energy, right? I would argue that we don't need all the energy that we've used consuming at the moment. And we have solutions. We have clean, green solutions, renewable energy. So I think we should go for that rather than going for energy sources that we know have problems, whether that's now emissions or whether that's nuclear waste, which is also, I mean, it's maybe not climate change, but it doesn't make it any less problematic.
Yeah, definitely nuclear has its downside and it's problematic. Those who are arguing for it are saying, you know, because renewable is not enough. So, you know, nuclear alongside with renewable to be able to generate power without, you know, a lot of emissions. And this is certainly now a debate here in France now that the president has suggested these new small-scale plants. I want to end this discussion by going back to COP26, and I'm going to ask each one of you to tell me what is one objective that you want to see achieved, you know, starting on Sunday, and what is one challenge you foresee? Each one of you. We can start with you, Carola, since you were just speaking, and then Sebastian, Laszlo, and Svenja.
That's a tough question. I think the key objective is really new commitment or repeated commitment to reducing emissions and reducing emissions drastically, even if it comes at some economic costs. But there's also so many benefits that we shouldn't forget. I mean, the challenge is really getting the polluters on board, because they, of course, for them, of course, it's most costly. I mean, everybody has the benefits of limiting global warming, but the polluters pay the most because they lose their source of income, and so they're clinging to that technology. But yeah.
Sebastian?
Yeah, I hoped of new national pledges and national promises. I mean, the problem is that the national determined contributions, so the commitments the states make, are currently not sufficient of reaching 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. But the even more pronounced problem is that the policies underlying these commitments pledges are really vague, and they're sometimes not established. And I just hope that one or the other states will use COP26 as a stage to announce one new promising goal and policy.
Thank you. Laszlo?
Yeah, because I work more on adaptation than mitigation. Let me just focus on that. And let's say the hope is that rich countries come up with a very strong commitment to contribute to the adaptation costs of poor countries that are really hit hard by climate change. There is a commitment, but it has to be scaled up, and Europe can also play an even stronger role in that. And the challenge, I think I already mentioned that, I think is perhaps the lack of trust. You know, there has to be an atmosphere of trust to make progress, and you know, I think we have to work on that.
Thank you. Svenja, also your contribution?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest point is I would be very happy if Glasgow is the beginning of a shift away from, you know, sort of commitments and pledges and towards action. And I think, you know, there is this sense that, you know, we all know how important this whole process is, but climate change is not a new topic, and we basically have reached a point that we've been warning about for a long, long time. So, you know, I think that urgency, the momentum seems to be there, but how can we make sure, and how can then the international community make sure that we do not end up just making great pledges and announcements? And that is my concern with these net zero announcements, because they are very ambitious. But unless you really have a strong mechanism that allows you almost, you know, month by month to put your finger on it and say, look, you know, you're just on the wrong track, and change that. I think that is essential. So yeah, that's my hope, that we're shifting towards that action momentum.
Yeah, I think we all agree that we're hoping this is more action-oriented, that they don't, you know, make pledges that they can't abide by, even if, you know, they're ambitious, because we've seen this in the past, unfortunately, and hoping that this will be a turning point and a real momentum for real action. On this note, we're ending today's discussion. I want to thank all four of you for joining us today, and all of those who've also joined on Zoom. Unfortunately, you know, there are pros and cons of having this online. Maybe more people can join, but then also the interaction is more challenging. But I think it was very interactive. Thank you for your input, and I want to thank all the students who contributed and participated to this very important discussion. I don't know if you have anything else to add that I haven't asked you about, you know, anything, a comment, a concern, or you're okay?
Thanks for a great facilitation.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say that really today's discussion is part of an ongoing dialogue on climate change that's being organized by CIVICA, and you will find, I think there's a slide that's going to play right now, the upcoming talks and public conferences that are going to happen you know, around this subject. So feel free to check this and also join in the future. And thank you for tuning in tonight. It was a very valuable conversation, and well, hopefully that COP26 is rewarding somehow and not disappointing. Thank you and good night.